In this video, I'm going to try to take you on a deep dive into Klavis Quadigy, specifically as an expressive ADSR envelope generator. This is the main purpose for which I purchased Quadigy, which offers an unusual number of expressive capabilities. Even if you're not in the market for a new ADSR, you may still find this video interesting because much of what I will review here can be accomplished with other ADSRs, although they may need some help from other modules. If you're not familiar with Quadigy, it's a quad envelope generator, unapologetically digital, packed with features, in a compact, affordable package, and with a thoughtfully designed, performance-friendly interface. There are other videos that provide a broad introduction to this module and its features, such as its extensive cycling capabilities. Here, we'll look deeper at classic gated ADSR use. To wit, I have prepared the simplest of East Coast style patches for this demonstration, a saw wave into a transistor ladder filter. That's what you're hearing. We are using the first of 4 envelope generators in Quadigy to open and close the filter cutoff. There's no VCA here, just the filter. I've added a little delay and reverb to soften up the sound. Let me explain what you're seeing in front of you. This is Quadigy. This cable here is our gate input to channel 1 of Quadigy, which is the only one we're using in this demo, but remember that Quadigy has 4 gate generators in it, envelope generators in it, excuse me, and they're all available for use. The output of Quadigy is running into the scope, and that's what we're seeing here. The green trace is our ADSR, and I've just sort of set everything to produce a kind of classic ADSR envelope. I also have set up on channel 2 of data an input jack, which we're going to use for CV modulation, and this will let us see our CV before it's passed into the CVA jack of Quadigy. Quadigy has 2 CV jacks. I'm going to assume you already basically understand what an ADSR is and how it differs from the AR or ASR envelopes that are common in modular synths. Although we're going to look at and listen to every parameter that Quadigy has to throw at it. Some of these things may seem rudimentary, but not all envelope generators behave the same way. And I'm going to show you exactly how Quadigy behaves, and you're going to see a lot about how Quadigy is operated. Let's listen to this sequence for a minute. The pitch changes, but every note sounds the same. It plods. Let's look at all the ways we can add expression to this sequence through envelopes. Our first axis of expression with Quadigy, as with any ADSR, is gate length. In this case, I'm using a sequencer that has a knob with which I can adjust the gate length, making it longer or shorter. Let's get our gates up here on the scope so that we can actually see them. So the yellow trace is the gate coming from my sequencer. You can see how the gate goes high and the envelope begins, the attack stage begins. You can see where the gate goes low and the release stage begins after the sustain stage. So I'm now just going to adjust the gate length briefly. I'm making it longer. This is off screen. I'm just turning a knob on my sequencer. If I keep turning it and making the gate length long enough, then eventually the notes start to run together. If I make the gates shorter, my envelope gets shorter, and you'll see that the part that's actually getting shorter first is the sustain stage, that horizontal leg. So as I turn the gate length shorter and shorter, I eventually erase the sustain stage, and then I start to also strip off the decay stage. And then eventually I start cutting into the attack. As my gate gets short enough, I pretty much reduce the envelope to nothing. Your gates may come from a sequencer like this, or they may come from a keyboard. They may come from any number of modular patching techniques for creating gates of variable length. Now, if you don't happen to have a handy way to create variable gates that you want, Quadigy can still help you out. You can turn on trigger mode. This is trigger mode. So, our envelope has now changed. Quadigy in trigger mode is no longer paying any attention to gate length. It only is paying attention to when the gate starts and treating it like a trigger. So if I adjust my gate length, again off screen, turning the knob on my sequencer, you see I made my gate much longer, but the envelope itself has not been affected. If I make the gate very short, still no effect. So how do we control the length of our envelope? Quadigy has several menus of parameters when you're in the envelope generator mode, which is our current mode here. This is the first page, the ADSR page. This is the second page, the third, and then there are several options after that. We're going to look at the second page at the H parameter. That's the hold parameter. And that corresponds to the second slider. By default, hold is 0. So I'm going to pick up 0 down here at the bottom, and I'm going to start raising the hold value. And you can see it's expressed in milliseconds. And at a certain point, my hold gets long enough that I start to have a sustain stage again on my envelope. And I can make it longer or shorter as I like. Hold is different from our gates. You remember our gate, the yellow trace, defines when the envelope begins and when the release stage begins. Hold, by contrast, determines the length of the sustain period only. If hold is all the way at 0, then you still get an attack, a decay, and a release. There's just not enough of a hold for there to be any noticeable sustain period. Bringing up the hold gets us there. Let's modulate this parameter. I'm going to bring in a simple sample and hold from Frat Tools Sapel. That's this blue trace here. You can see it's just changing voltage levels, going up and down. We're getting a new one with each gate. I'm going to enter the VC matrix, and I'm going to make sure that CVA is targeted, which it currently is. And now I'm going to add some, apply some CV, which I can do by percentage, either in the positive domain or the negative domain. I'll take this up to 40, which will be pretty obvious. And now I'll leave the VC matrix mode. You can already hear there's quite a bit of change happening from note to note as the sample and hold value rises and falls. I can fine-tune this by adjusting my hold and reining in a little bit. Now we're getting a combination of very short notes and longer ones, driven by our random CV voltage. So there you have some control through CV of your gate lengths if you're in trigger mode on Quadigy. I'm now going to put hold back to 0, and I'm going to clear out our CV assignment, which I do by entering CV matrix tapping here, choosing clear all CVs, and I'm done. So we'll go back now out of CV mode and back to the envelope generator. I also need to go here and switch back to gate mode, which is where I'm going to stay for the rest of the demo. And you can see our familiar envelope where we started. We've looked at gate length, which is normally an external factor that absolutely governs the length of your envelope, at least in terms of when the attack begins and when the release begins. Let's now review how the manipulation of the attack, decay, sustain, and release parameters give us more expressivity. Attack, decay, and release are all temporal parameters. So for example, if I adjust attack, you'll see that on the screen, the duration of my attack is expressed in milliseconds. And you can hear, as I raise it, that we get these longer attacks, but the overall length of our envelope stays pretty much the same. Again, that's because the length of the envelope is still governed by our gate. If I bring attack all the way to the bottom, to 0, then we have an instant attack, and you can see the voltage leaping from 0 all the way to its maximum, which is about 8 volts. And then the decay stage begins immediately. As I raise attack, it eventually gets long enough that it consumes the decay and sustain stages and becomes the entirety of the envelope. And once you get a slow enough attack, if I keep raising this and raising this, you'll see what we have of an envelope just sort of fades away. And that's simply because the attack is taking so long to go up, the gate is ending before it gets anywhere near 8 volts. And so it kind of just fades out. Now, if you don't like that, you have an option. It's called full attack. If you turn this on, you can immediately hear a difference. What's happening is Quadigy is now not allowing the envelope to stop in the middle of an attack. It's basically saying once you trigger this envelope, the attack is going to go all the way to 8 volts no matter what. And then whatever happens after that, happens after that. So if I bring attack down and then start raising it, we go over into this transitional area where the envelope loses some of its definition and it remains sort of a held envelope from one to the other, although we still get some attack and release here at these levels. If I take it high enough, it'll eventually just top out at 8 volts and stay there. Is this an expressive option? Well, that's up to you. You certainly could try to use it as such, just like I am doing now by hand, playing between the two sides of this sort of turnover point around the middle. So I'm going to turn the full attack back off now. Let's move on to decay. So decay, of course, works the same way. I can make it longer, in which case it takes longer to decay to our sustain stage from 8 volts. If I make it shorter, I can make it all the way 0, and now it drops. There's essentially no decay, so as soon as the attack is finished, it hits 8 volts and then it immediately plummets to whatever our sustain level is. At high enough levels, decay actually takes over pretty much the envelope and becomes its own sustain stage. So you can hear as I manipulate this, there's a lot of expressive nuance in this parameter. In fact, the main reason that I got Quadigy is that I wanted CV control over decay, and my old ADSRs did not offer that feature. Let's bring in a little CV. Here's our sample and hold. I'm just going to enter the CV matrix, and we've got A targeted. So I'm now going to add some sample and hold CV to our decay value. And now we can hear a nice variation, note to note. I'll bring the decay value down a little bit. The base decay value. And now it almost sounds like somebody's making a deliberate choice on how to express each of these notes, even though it's just coming from a random value. The release parameter works the same way. It's just a duration. So if I raise the release, then the notes start to blend together at a certain point. They never ever get back down to 0 volts. If I bring it down to 0, then it's as if I was releasing the key on an organ. The note just stops suddenly. So it has a legato or staccato sort of effect on your note expression. Just for fun, I'm going to go into the CV matrix and I'm going to target the user knob. That didn't work. Let's try again. There we go. U. So I'm going to apply some release CV, but it's going to be CV from this knob instead of from an external source. And now, when I adjust this knob, I can play Quadigy, moving between the staccato and these legato notes. And you can see on the screen, it's giving us little bar graphs that show the different values that are in play. So next to D, you see one jumping up and down, and that's our sample and hold CV that's being applied to decay. On R, as I turn the knob, you can see another bar going up and down that indicates the CV value I'm manually adding using the knob. One last detail about release. If you like having these long releases like this that tie notes together, but you'd like to have a little more definition between notes, there's an option over here called transition. We're currently in transition mode, which means that when one envelope ends and another envelope begins, then the new envelope just picks up wherever the old envelope left off. That's why this envelope doesn't actually quite finish insofar as it doesn't reach 0 volts. When the next envelope comes along, it just picks up from wherever the release was and heads off to 8 volts. I'm going to change this now to restart mode, and now you can see the difference. When the next envelope starts, it starts from 0. So that means that if the previous envelope is still decaying, it's still in the release phase, then that envelope will drop immediately to 0 volts so that the next envelope can begin from 0. And you'll hear it's a little bit sharper. I'm going to toggle back and forth between the two of them. This is restart. This is join. I'll go back to restart. Back to join. And that's where we'll stay for the rest of the demo. Unlike attack, decay, and release, sustain is not a temporal parameter. The sustain parameter instead sets the level of the sustain period of the envelope. Duration, again, is just a function of the gate length. So if I manipulate sustain, I'm going to raise and lower this shelf, this horizontal shelf there after the decay phase. Since we are using this envelope to modulate filter cutoff, when I lower the sustain, the note doesn't merely become sort of quieter in a sense, but we're also letting through fewer harmonics, so the timbre has changed as well. This is a fairly expressive parameter. This is something that you might want to put more attention into. For example, if I use our trusty sample and hold on here and bring in some CV, maybe I'll lower our starting sustain a little bit as well, since I'm adding voltage to it. We can hear we're getting different expression for each note. Some of them are louder, some of them have more harmonic character in them. Some of them are shorter, or not shorter, but they have just this short buzzy attack, and then a much more subtle sustain and release, because the filter is not opening as far as it was. Let's try something even more fun than that, however. I'm going to bring in another envelope. This one is from Chaos Tools' Zadar. So Zadar produces all sorts of arbitrarily fluctuating voltages. You can see in the blue trace the envelope that Zadar is producing with the same clock that's clocking my sequence. You can also see and hear how the particular envelope from Zadar has been added to the sustain phase of our envelope. Attack, decay, and release are not affected, just sustain, because I'm using this CV is coming in and modulating sustain. For even more fun, I'm now going to modulate Zadar. So now we're getting a different shape, the one in blue, for every single note. And you can hear how we're introducing all kinds of new harmonics and character to each of these different notes. Okay, let's jump over here to the third page of parameters on Quadigy's envelope generator section. We've looked at changing the duration of attack, decay, and release, but we can also change their curves. Many other ADSRs give you some sort of control over curvature, but few give you fully independent control over each attack, decay, and release curve like Quadigy does. So you can see here, I'm manipulating the curve shape of attack. Now I'm manipulating the decay curve. You can see in the screen and on the data trace how the waveform of my envelope is changing. Likewise, release. I can give it a shoulder like that, or I can make it concave. We'll actually hear the effect of release a little bit better if I go back and raise our sustain level a little higher. There it is, concave. And there's more of a convex effect. In fact, let's also bring release up a little bit. course, you can CV control any of these. So for example, these attack and decay curves actually have an interesting timbral effect on this particular patch. And that's actually a good thing to point out. While curves are not really a subtle thing, their effect can be more or less subtle depending on the situation you're using them in. In this case, I think that most of the interest is actually in the attack and decay curves. So for example, I'm going to go into the CV matrix. I'm going to target our knob again. So I'm going to hold that and tap U. There we go. And I'm going to set the attack curve CV to around 45 and the decay curve CV to around negative 45. Get out of there. Now when I adjust the user knob, both are going to move in more or less equal but opposite directions. So as I turn my knob this direction, they both bulge out. We get this brassier beginning to the note. When I turn the opposite direction, they both go concave, and that beginning of the note is more reduced to like a click sound. And of course, you could control this with CV voltage as well. And now we're going to look at some parameters in Quadigy that are even less common on ADSRs. We've used the first, second, and fourth sliders to control the curvature of the attack, decay, and release segments of our envelope. The third slider controls level. Level is the amplitude, the total amplitude of our envelope, which is normally, by default, 100%, so roughly 0 to 8 volts. If I go up here and catch a value at 100%, I can start to lower it. So I'm going to bring it down, and you can hear our notes get quieter. Bring it back up. You can also hear the timbre is changing. Of course, remember we are using these envelopes to open and close a filter cutoff. And so when the level is lower, the filter is not opening as far and more harmonics are being stripped out. So we get two things going by adjusting the level, both essentially the volume of the note, but also a bit of timbre. Of course, you can use CV manipulation for this as well. In this case, I'm going to leave us at full strength, 100%. We'll go into the CV section here. I'm just going to bring back our sample and hold. And this time we're going to add negative CV to our level. And now it's the sample and hold is giving us a nice variation, note to note, of louder, richer notes and quieter, simpler notes with fewer harmonics. We can go further than this by bringing in a different kind of modulation source. So here I brought in an LFO. You can see we're now amplitude modulating our envelope, and I can even speed up my LFO here into audio rates, and we're starting to throw off new harmonics. I'm just changing the speed of my LFO. There's nothing here that you couldn't do using a linear VCA position between the output of Quadigy and the filter in this particular patch. But because Quadigy has this built-in level parameter, you can do it all right here within Quadigy. We've looked at the classic ADSR parameters, we've looked at their variable curves, and we've looked at modulating the output of the envelope, but we still have a ways to go. Here on the second page of parameters, we have the punch parameter. That's the big P here, corresponding to the third slider. The punch parameter introduces an additional stage to the ADSR, a held stage between attack and decay. Let's take a look at that. By default, punch is 0. And punch, like attack, decay, and release, is a temporal parameter. So as I raise punch, we see up at the top of our envelope, there's a new horizontal segment, and as I make it punch a larger value, that segment gets longer and longer. I'll bring it back down to 0 where it starts out. So we're getting a nice burst of harmonics in our current patch by extending that segment between attack and decay. So just like all these other parameters, this gives us some more expressive capabilities. Bringing back our sample and hold, I'm going to add some CV to punch. And now we're getting this nice variation from note to note. Sometimes we get a big brassy blast at the beginning of the envelope. Sometimes we don't. Gate length still matters because this is a temporal parameter. As you noticed, perhaps, when I was adjusting the punch value, if I make it long enough, oops, there we go. If I get long enough, then punch will actually eat up the rest of our envelope, just like we've seen with parameters like attack and decay. It's still all very related to the length of our gate. So if I make my gate longer, which is what I'm doing off camera, then we start to see more of our envelope. I still have CV influencing this, so it's a little different every time. We can clear that out. And if I make the gate length short enough, so I'm making my gate shorter and shorter here, you'll see I will eventually trim off that punch parameter, just like I will trim off the decay and now the attack as well, which we've seen before. Our second to last parameter is pre-delay, PD. Now to show this, I'm going to bring in a trigger onto data, which we'll see here with our this yellow line. So that's the same trigger that is getting us our gate that's producing the envelope as well. So you can see the trigger and the gate line up perfectly. The attack stage starts where the trigger occurs. Pre-delay, PD, corresponds to our first slider here. And it is also a temporal parameter like attack, punch, decay, and release. And if I lower this parameter down to catch it and start raising it, you'll see that our envelope moves away from our gate as I'm adding time before attack begins. Now you'll also note, though, that the end of the envelope hasn't budged. As I raise the pre-delay, it's actually squishing my envelope, and I'm losing my sustain stage. And if I keep going, eventually I lose most of my envelope. In fact, at this point, the pre-delay is so high that I'm not getting any envelopes at all. That's because, like all the other parameters that involve time, gate length matters. So I can use this to offset my envelope here to the offbeat, where it's pretty close to now, but I may need to adjust my gate length again to bring back my full envelope shape that I started with. So what is this good for? Well, that's one possible use to move your note into the offbeat, or potentially to add some sort of syncopation related effect. But another thing I could do is, say, bring in some sample and hold and give it a little bit of CV. So I'm just going to give it, a little, say about 24%. And now the note sometimes falls on the clock and sometimes it lags by a little bit. So I've essentially introduced swing into my sequence. If I raise this too high, it'll start sounding drunk. If I bring it back down into the 15 to 20% range, then it's a subtle swing effect. This brings us to our final parameter, global time, or GT, corresponding to the fourth slider. Global time is a scalar in percentages for all of the temporal parameters. So that means pre-delay, it means attack, punch, decay, and release. So if I adjust global time, right now I have it set to 16%. That's actually where I had it set for the entire demo. If I raise it, all of those parameters are getting longer proportionally. If I shrink it, then they all tighten up. So you can hear, just by subtly modulating global time, we actually have quite a range of expression in here. But I'm just moving this very slightly. So you could CV this same parameter, probably subtly, to get quite a bit of expression, and in the right circumstances, this might be the way to go. If you go all the way to 0, then attack, decay, release, and any of the other temporal parameters have all gone to 0, and all we're left with now is our sustain. If I adjust my gate length over here on the sequencer, that's reflected in our trace, and you can certainly hear that. So that's all that's left with global time at 0, because that's the one thing global time cannot control, is your gate length. But if I take global time too high, then we start to see situations that we've seen before, such as attack is now so long that it actually takes over the entire envelope, and we just go from attack to release because there's no time left for anything else when the gate goes low. So that's global time. And that concludes my little thing here about Quadigy as an expressive envelope generator. We have looked at 12 different parameters. Don't forget that all these parameters can be CV controlled individually or in combination. There's the knob, there's the 2 CV jacks, and every one of those parameters for each of the 4 envelopes can make as much or as little use of these CV values as you want. And of course, there are the sliders, and you can play those as well, just as I have during this demonstration. I hope you found something thought-provoking on this little journey. Cheers!